Hey everybody, how are we doing this Saturday morning, afternoon, wherever you're at? Thanks so much for joining. This is the Big Axe stream, and so it's a bit of a cheeky title there on the thumbnail. Um, I know that these puns are buns; they stink, and other related assorted butt memes. But anyways, no, the Book of Acts is just chock full of all kinds of historical goodies. And I'm going to warn you guys in advance, this one might go a little bit long because I have like 130 something slides that we're going to go through because the Book of Acts is just so full of awesome historical information. We're also going to talk about some objections, address contradictions, different things like that, alleged historical discrepancies, mostly raised by Bart Ehrman, using him as a foil. You gotta love Bart. And so, yeah, this one should be good. So get some popcorn, get ready, strap in, because we're gonna be going through a lot of information. And so, yeah, it'll be fun. So without further ado, Acts is big facts. Why are we talking about this? Why is Acts like so important, right? A lot of times, a lot of apologists will focus their attention on the historical reliability of the Gospels. I definitely do that. But we want to address this because there's this claim, this charge out there that Paul basically just hijacked Christianity, right? You hear this among Muslims, you hear this among cultists like New Age gurus like Aaron Abke. Someone says that I'm cutting out. Let me know if that is true on anybody else's side. Just looking at the live chat there. So if I need to do something with the internet, just keep saying stuff in the chat, I guess, and let me know. But as I was saying, Paul is like vilified progressive Christians, cultists, atheists, Muslims. They all want to say that he hijacked religion, the religion of Christianity, and turned it into something that it absolutely is not. He turned it into a religion about blood sacrifice and Jesus being God and all these other things. But then you see the Book of Acts, and Paul is hanging out with the disciples. He's being approved by the disciples. He's being sent out basically by the disciples. And so people try to say, well, this is just propaganda, that Luke is writing an account to smooth over the tension between the Pauline kind of Christians and those who followed Peter and James and whatnot. And so we're going to see why that claim is completely false. And so I guess I kind of already went through this. The claim is that Jesus was a Jewish teacher, a prophet who preached repentance in the kingdom of God, but Paul turned him into a divine savior, invented the resurrection story, ditched the law, taught blood sacrifice for salvation. In this view, Paul's letters represent a radically different religion than what Jesus taught. Acts is just damage control. So the reason why Acts destroys this narrative is that Luke claims to have sourced material from original eyewitnesses. Luke claims that he was with Paul in Jerusalem, where all the elders were present. That means he was with James, Jesus's brother. He could have possibly been around Mary and got information from her. He would have been around the other elders, such as Peter, all the apostles, basically. Luke also stayed with Paul in Caesarea for 2 years, which is near Jerusalem, giving him access to resurrection witnesses. His proximity to the apostles means he could verify claims about Jesus's resurrection appearances. And if Luke does show historical care and accuracy, and he does show that he's really present with Paul and risking his life for the Gospels, then that also has some significant evidential weight. And then, of course, the details in Luke's Gospel are corroborated, as we're going to see over and over and over again, suggesting that he was a faithful transmitter of the eyewitness testimony, and that Acts shows Paul working alongside the original apostles and not against them. So the negative case, we're going to talk about the negative case first. Just to get through it, you have Bart Ehrman, who says, as valuable as Acts may be and as an interesting story about the first years and decades of the early Christian movement, the reality is that the Book of Acts is not historically reliable. So Ehrman has a whole blog series. I think he also did a short video with Apologia about his negative view of the Book of Acts. And we will see as we go along that Ehrman's objections just really are pretty whack. So some of the first objections that Ehrman says is that Acts internally even contradicts himself, showing that the author of the Book of Acts is just trying to relate something of what he thinks is theological importance, but isn't even interested enough to uh, keep his own narrative straight. And so Ehrman says on 3 occasions, Acts narrates the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus. Chapters 9, 22, and 26 compare them closely to one another, and you will find some very odd contradictions. And so he says that Acts 9, verses 22, do Paul's companions hear anything? Acts 9 through 26, are Paul's companions knocked down or are they standing? And Acts 9 through 22, verse 26, is Paul instructed by Ananias or not? And so we'll go through all 3 of these real quickly here. And so here again is a quote from Ehrman on his blog. He says, all these examples simply show that Luke was far more interested in telling a gripping story than he was being consistent. His artistic license has seriously undercut his historical accuracy. So is that a fact, Bart? Is that the for realsies? So we will see. So Ehrman says in chapter 9, Paul's companions hear the voice of Jesus talking to Paul, but they don't see anyone. In chapter 22, they see a light, but they don't hear anything. So which is it? And so Acts 9, it says that the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing nobody. But in Acts 22, it says, now those who were with me saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking with me. And so there seems to be an apparent contradiction. Do they hear the voice, or do they, see a light, but not hear a voice, right? And so what's going on here? So how do we reconcile this? Well, the Greek verb used here can mean hear or understand. It doesn't just mean like hear and hear only. It could also mean understand. And that many modern translations actually pick up this nuance. If you read the ESV, NIV, NASB, NET, many other translations, it says that they did not understand the voice, not that they did not hear the voice. And so using the same Greek word, we see this in parallel examples in Luke's writing, as well as in the other gospels like Mark. And so Luke 6:27 says, I say to you who hear, which really means I say to you who understand, right? Mark 4:33, parables heard only as they were able to hear. Well, he's talking about the hearing of understanding, not just like hearing, sound waves bouncing off your eardrums. And there's also the detail that is in Acts 26:14. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. So if Paul's companions happen to be Greek speakers, they heard the sound, but they didn't understand the words. And so there you go. This isn't really all that difficult to reconcile at all. And so I don't see what the big deal is. I see people reacting to my face. Maybe they expected somebody younger. Maybe I am younger, and just doing apologetics ministry and reading my comments section has aged me rapidly over the past few months. And so, anyways, terrible joke there. Ehrman goes on. It says in Acts chapter 9, the companions are left standing while Paul falls to the ground. In chapter 26, they are all knocked to the ground. Which is it? Acts 9:7, it says that the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, where in Acts 26:14, says when they all had fallen to the ground. Okay, so like what's going on here? Are they standing or are they on the ground? Have they fallen? Well, what's the deal, right? Bart is wrong again. Most probably the phrase stood speechless is simply an idiomatic expression that means they were stopped dead, like say that you were frozen in your tracks, without insinuating that they were standing up the entire time. We do expect variation when people are telling and retelling stories as well. And I don't see why these things couldn't like have happened in different stages or whatever. But again, it's most likely just an idiom. And Bart is just taking a very narrow, wooden, literalistic reading and trying to assume that Luke is just an idiot who's contradicting himself. This is really, really weak stuff. Bart's third objection, and I think this is actually the weakest one, in chapters 9 and 22, Paul is told to go to Damascus to be instructed by a man named Ananias about what to do next. In chapter 26, Paul is not told to go be instructed by Ananias. Instead, Jesus himself instructs him. Well, which is it? This is really bad, Bart. So Luke's omission is not a denial. It's just an omission. Ehrman treats it like a contrary assertion to force a contradiction. But think about it. Paul is standing before Agrippa, right? He's standing before this Roman ruler. Why is he going to mention Ananias, who he does mention in chapter 22, because he's talking to Jews, and he mentions that Ananias was devoted to the law, like them, basically. He's trying to build common ground. But why is he going to mention that to Agrippa, who doesn't even care, right? It's not even relevant to his audience. And so this is just very, very, very weak sauce from Ehrman. So let's continue. He says that Acts contradicts itself in the scene of the ascension. He says in Acts 24, you can read it for yourself and see, Jesus rises from the dead on that day, meets with his disciples, and then again that day he ascends to heaven from the town of Bethany. But when you read Acts 1, written by the same author, you find that Jesus did not ascend on that day or that place. So he's saying he didn't ascend that same day. It was 40 days later, and he ascends from Jerusalem. Jesus instead spends 40 days with his disciples, proving to them that he had been raised from the dead. And only then, 40 days after his resurrection, does he ascend. There he ascends not from Bethany, but Jerusalem. Luke tells the same story twice in two radically different ways. Historical accuracy does not appear to be his major concern. And so, in a nutshell, Luke can't get his own story straight about the ascension. Luke 24, he rises and ascends the same day from Bethany. Acts 1, he stays 40 days, ascends later from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And so Luke tells the same story twice, but contradicts himself both times. Is that really what's going on? Well, come on, let's give Luke the benefit of the doubt here. He can't possibly be that stupid, would he be? Right? He doesn't say that it all happened on the same day. Rather, he condenses the events, which is just a rhetorical method called telescoping, common in ancient historians. We see this in Sallust, Cicero, Quintilian, and so forth. This is just something that they used to telescope events. Somebody asked, is this pre-recorded? Nope, this is live, buddy. For a long period. First of all, there's a dinner at Emmaus in 24:29. Then there is a 7-mile walk back to Jerusalem, which would have taken a couple of hours. There's an extended period of teaching and fellowship. And then they walk all the way back to Bethany, which again would take about an hour and 50 minutes. According to my quick search, just using Google and asking how long it would take to walk. So trying to cram this all into one evening doesn't make any sense. How are they going to see Jesus ascend into heaven? Like, is he just shining in the light of the moon or what? And so Luke either leaves the time vague purposely or saves fuller details for Acts. Maybe he was even running out of scroll. Papyrus was not necessarily cheap in the ancient world, and he's just looking at the scroll and thinking, I got to wrap this up. And so that's what he does. It's not really a big problem here. Plus, Ehrman is doubly wrong. Luke 24:50-51, it says that he, just reading the verses for ourselves, it says, and he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And then in Acts 1:12, they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. So Acts 1 doesn't even say that Jesus ascended from Jerusalem. It just says they returned to Jerusalem. So there's no contradiction. And also Bethany sits on the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives and is only 4 miles away from Jerusalem. So like, what are we even doing here? Like Bart just looks like he's looking for trouble. He's saying that Luke doesn't seem to care about historical accuracy. That's not his concern. But it seems like scholarly consistency is not Ehrman's main aim here. This is not good. This is not good at all. So I think these are more of the stronger objections, but still not very good. Acts supposedly contradicts Paul's own letters. All right. So this is Ehrman again. When Paul himself talks about his conversion in Galatians 1, he insists that after he had his vision with Jesus, he absolutely and positively did not, he swears to it, go to confer with the other apostles in Jerusalem, not for years. And what happens when Paul converts according to Acts 9? What is the first thing that he does after he leaves Damascus? He makes a beeline to Jerusalem to confer with the other apostles. In Acts, he does precisely what he himself swears he did not do. So there's that word precisely. I don't think that it means what you think it means, Bart. And so let's see. Sorry, I looked at the chat there for a second. So let's answer these one by one, because there's several objections that Bart raises here in this supposed contradiction. And this might be the best of the lot when it comes to objections against Acts. So he didn't go to Jerusalem right away. Well, Galatians 1:17 says that Paul says he didn't go to Jerusalem immediately, but spent time in Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Whereas Acts 9:23 says after many days, Paul left Damascus for Jerusalem. But how long can many days be? I mean, I'm not saying just because it's in the Bible, First Kings. First Kings has a many days, and then it says that it was over a period of about 3 years. I'm not saying that Kings is in the Bible, Acts is in the Bible, and so then 3 years can many days. Haha. But I am saying like this is used in other historical sources. First Kings happens to claim to be a historical source, and many days, 3 years, that would be many days, right? Also, Acts doesn't claim that Paul immediately went to Jerusalem. It just compresses time, as Luke often does, as we literally just saw with the ascension scene where he compresses a 40-day period at the end of his gospel. But Ehrman also says that Acts leaves out the trip to Arabia. True, Acts does indeed skip Paul's Arabia trip, but omission is not a contradiction. Luke just summarizes Paul's time in Damascus before Jerusalem. Arabia just wasn't relevant to his point. Again, Luke skips large portions of time in other places. We see like just in Acts chapter 12 and 13, there's a whole period of 3 years that Luke just skips. This is just something that he does. Again, the other objection, Paul says he didn't meet with Christians. Acts says that he did. So Bart says that in Galatians 1:16 through 17, Paul says he didn't consult with anybody, but in Acts it says that he was with the disciples in Damascus. But the word consult in the Greek means that he didn't seek the approval, or can mean that he didn't seek approval or teaching from them, not that he completely avoided Christians. The New Testament scholar Thomas Schreiner says that Paul is claiming independence of his authorship. He's not saying that he just spent his entire time in isolation from all other believers. And so Paul's point here is not just like to give a blow-by-blow biographical account. His point is more theological. Finally, Ehrman says that Paul only met with James and Peter and James, not the apostles. And so Galatians says that Peter and James were the ones that he met with. But then we see in Acts 9:26 through 30, it just says that he tried to join the disciples and met with apostles. But Luke is giving a summary here. Paul met with representatives of the apostles. So like today in our own modern vernacular, when we say that so-and-so met with Congress, it doesn't mean that he's meeting with like every single person in Congress. It could only mean like a few members were present that are representing Congress, right? And so this isn't really a discrepancy, again, unless we are reading like over hyperliterally like Bart tends to do. I don't know if that's like some of his fundamentalist background coming out or what. But this, again, might be the best contradiction that Bart has against the Acts and Paul's letters. And when you really look at it, it falls apart. Inspiring Philosophy has a really good video on this very topic. If you want like fuller details, I would recommend you to that video. And so, folks in the chat, I don't know what y'all are debating, but like, this isn't like your personal debate club. So if there's any mods listening, like this is your warning. If not, you're going to start getting put in times out or banned. Like we're not debating the destruction of the Canaanites or Islam versus Christianity right now. So, yeah, knock it off. Please, like, focus. Like, why are you here if you're not going to pay attention? It doesn't make sense. You can't even like type a whole lot in a live chat. I never understand it. You know, you go to any religion live stream and it's like you see this the whole time and it's a distraction. It's weird. So anyways, mods, you are fully authorized to start ban hammering if people don't listen, or at least putting them in timeout. Anyway, at first. And then if they continue, go ahead. Anyway, going back to what I was talking about there, notice the mention of Damascus in both accounts, right? And so Damascus, like, what is Damascus? Like, it doesn't play a major role in Christian history other than Paul's conversion, right? It's not like a major thing that we see in the New Testament. So if Luke had used Galatians, it would make no sense for him to include Paul's time in Damascus, but omit the key details that Paul mentions, like his trip to Arabia and a 3-year gap that would be sloppy and suspicious. But instead, Luke's account in Acts chapter 9 casually mentions Damascus without explaining the timeline. Now, that is exactly what we would expect if he knew that Paul's story was, if this was two independent accounts, right? And so it's actually an undesigned coincidence, not a contradiction, because again, Damascus just doesn't figure prominently in either accounts, but it's just like it ends up in both. And so yeah, I just don't see a discrepancy. If anything, these accounts overlap pretty well. There's also another way that they overlap well. There's this really short visit, right? There's Paul's famous visit with Peter, where he says, after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and I remained with him for 15 days. And so it's like, man, Paul, like, this is the guy who spent 3 years with Jesus. Like, wouldn't you want to spend just like a little bit more time with him? So why such a short visit? Why was it cut short? Well, Acts 9:29 tells us, it says that he spoke and disputed against the Hellenists, but they were seeking to kill him. And when the brothers learned this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. So no further comment seems necessary. It seems like both accounts fit together just fine. That explains the short visit. They were trying to off the guy. So there you go. How many Jerusalem trips? This is another contradiction, allegedly, from Ehrman. He says, according to Paul's account, the Second Jerusalem Council was only the second time that he had been to Jerusalem, Galatians 1:18-1. According to Acts, it was his third prolonged trip there, Acts chapter 9, Acts chapter 11, and Acts chapter 15. Once again, it appears that the author of Acts has confused some of Paul's itinerary, possibly intentionally, for his own purposes. So, yeah, how many trips? 2, 3? It depends on what you're reading, according to Bart. But let's take a look at this. In Galatians 1:18-19, it says, Paul says, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Then in Galatians 2:1, it reads, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas. Now, Ehrman insists that Galatians 2 must refer to Paul's second ever visit, implying a contradiction with Acts, but Paul actually never says that. Acts 11:30 describes Paul going to Jerusalem during a famine between missionary journeys. So why didn't Paul mention that trip? It's very possible that it wasn't relevant to his point. He's talking about apostolic authority in the gospel, not about famine relief. I just did a whole video on this in more detail if you want to check that out. But just giving you kind of a quick summary, Ehrman pushes back on this whole response. Okay, this is in the Myth Vision podcast. He heard this response to reconcile this objection, and he says, well, wait a second. Paul only claims to have organized a collection late in life, right? And Acts 11:30 shows an early famine relief trip with Paul and Barnabas, like 10, 12 years later, when he's writing the book of Romans. Because in Romans, he talks about this collection that he's bringing from the Gentile churches to the poor saints in Jerusalem in relief. But this is just completely wrong, right? Like, why can't there be two different collections? And in fact, like, we see two different collections in the book of Acts. And so, and it all dovetails in a way that just can't possibly be explained by the writer of Acts looking at Paul's letters and copying all this information, right? It's just too subtle, and we'll see that right now. In 1 Corinthians 16:1-2, Paul gives the Corinthians instruction about the collection. He says, on the first day of every week, each of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then in 2 Corinthians, in his follow-up letter, he's writing, the first letter he's writing from Ephesus. This is something that almost all scholars agree on. The second letter, Paul is writing from Macedonia, and he's arranging the contributions. And Paul, what he does here is he kind of in a cheeky way advises the Corinthians that he's been bragging about them to the Macedonians, and that he intends to bring some people from Macedonia with him to Corinth, and that he doesn't want them to be ashamed by not having their portion of the offering ready for his arrival. So he's almost like laying it on pretty thick and pressuring them to like get their stuff together and get it all ready. and not to be put to shame by the other churches who have given a lot, right? And or having people that he's coming from Macedonia to pick up the collection, and they're like, scurrying about and trying to get it all together. And then you read later in Romans 15, 25 through 27, which is written around 57 AD. He's finally preparing to deliver the funds. He says, I'm on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem. All right, now this is where it gets pretty cool, I think. When you read Acts 19 through 21, in particular, chapter 19, verse 21, you see that Paul's travels match the same route: Ephesus, Macedonia, Greece, then Jerusalem. He says, now after these events, Paul resolved in the spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And so Acts, in this really subtle, undesigned way, it's not like he's like reading all of this, piecing it all together and being like, wow, I'm going to really like wow them here and put these words into Paul's mouth and have him say, these are the places that he's going, guys. And then he's going to end up in Jerusalem. And then he's going to get to the big grand finale where he's going to like deliver these alms. And all you have in Acts 24:17, when he finally speaks about the alms that he came to bring, this is all we get. He's speaking to Felix after being arrested in Jerusalem. And he says, after several years, so that implies that he had been in Jerusalem before, I came to bring alms. So multiple visits, multiple aid efforts. Out of the words of Paul himself, I don't know how Ehrman misses this. And then the letters and Acts dovetail in a way that's like completely undesigned, totally smacks of eyewitness testimony. All of this completely collapses Ehrman's claim. Like, I don't even know what he's talking about. This is terrible. If anything, like if you read this closely, this shows you like just how historical Acts is and how much this author must have been traveling with Paul, because he's got all this inside information, right? This isn't something that's going to just be like spread from word of mouth through a long chain of oral tradition. And these are all the little details that people are going to remember. These minute details are the kind of things that are like not going to be remembered, right? Like a boring collection, and this is his travel route, and this is where he all got it from. So hopefully that makes sense. I think that's like pretty cool. I think this is like huge historical evidence for the reliability of Acts, not the other way around. I basically just said everything that I was going to say on this slide. I keep doing that, but that's okay. Acts contradicts Galatians again. All right, so here is Ehrman. He's back with another contradiction. According to the book of Acts, when Paul was earlier persecuting the Christians in Christ, it was specifically the Christian churches in Judea and Samaria. Why is it the Christians in the churches he had formerly persecuted didn't know what he looked like? Wasn't he physically present among them as their enemy earlier? According to Acts, yes. According to Paul, no. And so basically he's saying that Paul, we'll look at it here. He says that they didn't, they saw him, but then like they didn't see him. Where's this reputation coming from, right? But when you read Acts 8:1-3, and I just made a short on this, Acts 8:1-3 makes a key distinction. Paul's persecution was targeted at the church in Jerusalem, not the wider region of Judea. The believers scattered in Judea and Samaria would naturally share stories of persecution, so Paul's reputation spread. But those outside of Jerusalem wouldn't have known him by sight, only by what they heard, which fits exactly what we see in Galatians 1:22-23. They were only hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And so like, this isn't really that hard to think through. Like, I don't even see, at this point, it just looks like Bart is like manufacturing contradictions to make his case stronger. And if you just like, I don't know, use an ounce of charity and rub two brain cells together, this isn't at all hard to reconcile. All right, so we're nearing the end of Bart's contradiction case here. I think this is the last one. Acts contradicts Paul's theology. So here's Ehrman again, writing on his blog. In Romans, Paul tells us that pagans worship idols precisely because they do not know there was only one God who was to be worshipped, and they rejected that knowledge in full consciousness of what they were doing. And because of that, God casts his wrath down upon them. Well, which is it? Do they commit idolatry out of pure ignorance, so God overlooks their mistake? When you and That's what Paul says. He's like, hey, you know, he's overlooking that stuff now, but now he commands you to repent, right? Or are they fully aware of what they're doing so God judges them? Assuming Paul himself knew what his own views were, you would have to say that Acts has misrepresented the very core of his preaching message. And so, if you actually read the verses, Acts 17, Paul's opener, he's not bashing them worshiping idols so much, but he starts off with their altar to an unknown God as proof that they admit that they don't know who he is. That's his hook to present the true God. So when Paul says that God once overlooked their ignorance, he's not praising them, because in Greek thought, ignorance of God was shameful, especially for philosophers, and he's speaking in Athens. The call here is to repent, not to just learn, and the day of judgment is already fixed, meaning that idols are out. So, gold, silver, and stone idols are not to be worshipped. And so Paul is not praising them necessarily. And he's saying that they overlook their ignorance, but Romans says the same thing. In Romans 1, which is where Bart is saying that there's this contradiction, Paul argues that no one can claim ignorance as an excuse for idolatry, since God's existence and nature are clearly seen in creation, right? We've all read that verse in Romans 1:20. But if you read in Romans 3:25, Paul says a similar thing. He says that God passed over previous sins because in his divine forbearance, this is what he does, right? And so Paul is focusing on the forbearance of God in the redemptive plan, just like he does in his speech on Mars Hill. And so also, if you just think about it for like 2 seconds, Paul is writing to a church, right? And so he's not going to talk to them the same way that he would just talk to pagans when he's preaching a message, right? He's trying to build common ground, not just beat them over the head for their idol worship. And so there's no contradiction here. Again, Paul talks about forbearance from previous sins done in ignorance in both passages. And so Acts and Romans do not actually contradict. Also, here's a little bit of archaeological confirmation found in this very story. Inscriptions to unknown gods are found in Pergamum, Miletus, Phrygia, and Rome, and they match Paul's reference. Ancient writers like Pausanias describe these altars in Athens, including one to an unknown god. These were likely linked to real events like a 6th century BC plague appeasement ritual. This is according to the archaeologist Titus Kennedy. This shows that Luke's detail was actually credible. Paul used an actual Athenian altar as a perfect opening to present the one true God. And so, yeah, there you go. There's actually archaeological confirmation that backs Luke's account up, that we do see these altars out there. So let's take a quick drink here. All right. Acts makes historical blunders. We'll just cover a few of these. Ehrman, again, on his blog, says there are lots of mistakes in Acts as well, like when Gamaliel in chapter 5 talks about Judas of Galilee coming after Theudas, which is just wrong. So he's referring to Acts chapter 5 and verse 37, right? And so there, Gamaliel, who Paul reportedly learned under, refers to Judas of Galilee, and he's linked in AD 6 through 7 and under a census under Quirinius, according to Josephus, right? And so the critics say that this is a contradiction because Josephus places Theudas later. But that assumes that only one Theudas ever existed. Josephus himself says that Judea was crawling with would-be messiahs and rebel leaders. This is according to Josephus, Antiquity 17:10-8. And Theudas was a common name, not much different than Judas, right? Now, the name Theudas is a Greek form of names like Nathaniel or Mathaniah, and there were multiple uprisings by men with common names, which is exactly what Josephus kept happening. So it just could be another Theudas that's not really that hard to reconcile. Now, I could imagine somebody like Ehrman saying, well, this is just special pleading, and you're just kind of wishing and hoping, and we have this reference of a Theudas in Josephus, so why won't we go with that? Well, we have a similar situation with another person by the name of Lysanias. who Luke names as the Tetrarch of Abilene in Luke 3:1. Now, previously, skeptics scoffed at this because Josephus records that Lysanias killed decades way too early. So it looked like Luke made a big historical mistake. But then there was an inscription, the Abila inscription, which mentions another Lysanias ruling Abilene during Tiberius's reign, which is exactly when Luke said. So the bottom line is that critics often assume way too quickly that similar names means contradiction. It's like, come on, guys, like people can have the same name, right? Like imagine us trying to do history this way in like modern times. Like, well, that guy's name was, I don't know, Joe Pesci. I don't know. I'm just kidding. So I don't know, Jim Bob Hullabaloo. Okay. And like there couldn't be another Jim Bob Hullabaloo. Okay. Maybe Jim Bob Hullabaloo isn't the best example, but you guys know what I mean, right? Like people can have the same names. We've met people with the same names. If I type Eric Manning into Facebook, like 10 different people come up. So like, come on. This is the Abila inscription that I was referring to. And so archaeological confirmation that the critics were wrong and Luke was actually vindicated. All right, with that, we will go into some external confirmations. And so that is the end of the whole contradiction and historical errors part. And so let's see if I have any super chats or anything else like that. If you want to send a super chat, if you have questions, you can do that. It doesn't look like we have any so far, so I am just going to dive in. Oh, we do have one. Let me see here. Let's see. King Tesseract, $10. Thank you. He says skeptics are throwing Q away, saying Matthew made a detailed version of Mark. Luke tried to one-up it. Luke would have talked endlessly about the temple destruction. They forgot why they needed the Q hypothesis. Yeah, that's a fair point. You would think that Luke would mention the fulfillment of Jesus's prophecy about the temple destruction, but he doesn't. And so there's also some kind of discrepancies of like the way that Jesus predicts and makes commands about when they should pray and all this other stuff. And then you look at like when the temple destruction actually happened. I think he says like pray that your flight isn't in winter, and it wasn't in winter. Like the temple destruction actually happened, I believe, in the spring and things like that. And so yeah, no, thank you for that. I appreciate the super chat. All right, external confirmations. We've already kind of talked about some of them. One of them even being the Lysanias one. These are places where the Gospels and Acts mention in passing facts about the historical setting. The more casual the mention, the better. The more obscure the facts, the better. And here's the thing: Luke gets a lot of hard things right. He gets difficult things right. Now you got to remember, Luke didn't have access to Google. He didn't have access to Wikipedia. He didn't have access to ChatGPT. So he couldn't like just easily look these things up, right? These are difficult things to get right. We're not talking about him naming who Pilate was, okay? Or who was emperor of Rome. Like these are difficult facts, right? And there are dozens and dozens of these. We're going to go through a good handful. So we'll start with Sergius Paulus. In Acts 13:7, Sergius Paulus called proconsul. Cyprus became a senatorial province in 22 BC, ruled by proconsuls, not legates. This is according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio in his Roman history. Later, under the Flavian empires, which would be post-70 AD, Cyprus likely became imperial again and would have been governed by legates. If Luke was written late, as many scholars claim, Luke should have called him by a legate. Instead, Luke actually gets the correct title. It's just right for the time of Paul's visit, which would have been around 47 to 48 AD. This is exactly the kind of minor local administrative detail that would be very easy to get right, get wrong, excuse me. But Luke absolutely hits the nail on the head. And so yeah, like this is pretty awesome because like this would be something that would be easily mixed up if it was written late. And so this is kind of like indirect evidence that the book of Acts was written early. Now, whether it's early, like in the 60s, like I tend to hold, or whether it's like in 85, which would be like where Bart Ehrman would say that it's written, I think it's pretty minor as long as it's like based on eyewitness testimony. Like that's the real important thing. But this is a point in favor for early dating as well as historical reliability. Now, also more about Sergius Paulus. There's an inscription. So we have more archaeological confirmation here from Soli. Cyprus mentions in the proconsulship of Paulus. Luke dates to the first century, possibly around 50 AD, if under Claudius. Even if not exactly the same guy, it confirms the Paulus family's presence in Cyprus. And so, again, archaeological confirmation. And then there's yet another inscription in Pisidian Antioch, which names Lucius Sergius Paulus the Younger, son of Lucius. So this is pretty cool right here. We have a Roman official with ties to the Paulus family, possibly of the very same lineage. Now think about it for just a second. In Acts 13 through 14, after Cyprus, Paul and Barnabas go directly to Pisidian Antioch. That's not the nearest or even most obvious stop. So you have Sergius Paulus, who hears Paul's preaching. And if you remember the story, there was Elymas the sorcerer, right? And he's trying to turn Sergius away from the faith. Paul looks at the guy dead in his eye and basically commands him to go blind. He starts fumbling around, needing people to like lead him around, right? And because he sees this notable miracle, it says that Sergius converts. And so you could imagine him seeing like this amazing miracle, hearing the gospel, being excited, and sending Paul and Barnabas to be like, "Hey, can you talk to my my kin here and bring the gospel to them?" And I mean, that I don't know. Again, it's a little speculative, but it's not based on nothing here. And so I don't know. I just think that's pretty cool. Moving on to Acts chapter 14, Paul goes to Lystra, and there's this bit about the Lycaonian language. Ooh, I spelled that bad. Language. Anyways, it's forever immortalized on the internet. So what happens in Lystra? Paul heals a crippled man, and Acts 14 notes that the crowd shouted in Lycaonian, not Greek, which would be unusual in a cosmopolitan Roman colony. They ought to be speaking Greek. But according to the classical historian Colin Hemmer, which I'll talk about in a little bit here, he notes that Lystra, though Roman, was a rural part of Anatolia where the locals actually preserved their native tongue. So this actually is a rare specific cultural detail that Luke just happens to get right. Now, it's also interesting, if you remember from the story, the locals, they kind of they think that Paul is and Barnabas are Zeus and Hermes, right? So Acts 14:12 says that Barnabas is called Zeus, Paul is called Hermes, and the inscriptions confirm that Zeus Hermes were worshipped in Lystra. Now, Ovid's Metamorphoses, I hope I'm saying that right, anyway, tells of Zeus and Hermes visiting Phrygia right next to Lycaonia, mirroring local legend, and identifying the speaker as the lesser god actually matches the ancient belief about divine visits. Like the more important god would have like a spokesman. And so again, this fits the local cultural milieu of a bit of a remote place, speaking a language that where normally that language wouldn't have been spoken. And then we have their own religious customs being brought out, and Luke again nails the detail right. And so this doesn't look like fiction. This looks like something that is based in actual historical events. Moving on to Acts 16, we get this bit in Acts 16:14 about a seller of purple goods named Lydia from Thyatira. Now, according to the eminent New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce, he says that the people of that area were, in fact, famed for their skill in the manufacture of purple dye extracted from the juice of the madder root. This is in his commentary on Acts. And there are also many inscriptions that Colin Hemmer talks about in his book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. There are at least 7 found in the Thyatira region that mention the purple dye trade. And it also had a strong textile and dyeing industry known across all of Asia Minor. And a guild of purple merchants is also attested in Philippi, where Lydia was active. Bruce notes that dyeing with the madder root was still in use there before being superseded by chemical dyes, which would have been in the last, 100 or 200 years or so. So, this is, again, an obscure, weird little factoid that you can't just, like, he can't just look this up. Even if he had like libraries back then, right? It's not like he would just walk into the library, pull a book off the shelf with binding and page numbers and an index or anything else like that. These guys had scrolls and all this other stuff, right? So this it's better explained on the hypothesis that like Luke was familiar with this in his writing history rather than the whole idea that like he's just kind of making up a story as he goes along, right? So here's another one that's kind of weird. Paul takes this walk, and it's kind of like, what is he doing, right? He's on the ship in Acts 20:13 through 14, and he chooses to get off the ship and actually walk from Troas to Assos while his companions sail. So at first, this looks really weird, right? I mean, you can see the map there. There's Troas at the top there. You see the ship, and then there's Assos, which is all the way around. And it's like, why not just stay on the ship? That would be a lot better than just like walking a really long time, right? So what's going on? But geographically, again, this is from drawing from Colin Hemmer here. This makes sense. The ship had to sail around Cape Lectum, which was actually pretty rocky and had a long, risky route. And the ship would actually travel like really, really slowly because of all the rocks and like the rough terrain, right? And Colin Hemmer says that Paul staying behind at Troas and traveling overland to rejoin the ship's company at Assos is actually appropriate for the local circumstances. And so, again, this is just an obscure geographical detail that Luke absolutely gets right. And it makes sense of Paul's kind of strange walk. Then you get to Acts 21, and then you get to this port called Patara. So in Acts 21, 1 through 2, Paul and his companions sail from Rhodes to Patara. Then they catch a ship to Phoenicia. Colin Hemmer notes that Patara was a major hub for the Alexandrian grain fleet involved in the imperial corn trade or grain trade. It's not corn, but you know that's just what a general term for multiple types of grain, right? Ships from Egypt to Rome often stopped there for transshipment, and then granaries were later built there under Hadrian. So Luke's note that they found a ship crossing to Phoenicia fits 100% with Patara's role. What's also notable here is that Luke uses the correct neuter plural form of Patara, matching the local inscriptions and their literary usage. So this is just another example of precise historical and geographical awareness in the book of Acts. Now, here's another one. I really love this one. This is a fun one. So Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. He gives this long speech before the Jews. They're all upset because they think that he brought Gentiles into the temple, and they are just ticked off, right? And he gives this long speech, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and they are not having it, and he's arrested, right? Now, Paul avoids flogging by revealing that he's a Roman citizen by birth. If you just go and read the story for yourself, he's like, hey, you can't beat me. I'm a Roman citizen. Like, what are you doing, right? And the tribune who's about to beat him is shocked. And he's like, you're a Roman citizen? He's like, I am too, but I had to buy this citizenship with a large sum. Now, again, Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, confirms that citizenship could be purchased under Claudius. And he says that though the privilege was at first sold only for large sums, it later became so cheapened that a man could become a citizen by giving the right person some bits of broken glass, right? And so like it first started off very expensive, and then at some pressure and some conniving of Claudius's wife, the prices went down. And so the tribune likely assumed that Paul got his citizenship cheaply or through bribes or something. And he was still feeling kind of the sting of being ripped off, right? And so like this is just narrative that is just like chock full of like realism, right? Like I don't know, it just has that ring of truth to it, and he just seems like totally deflated. But does Luke stop and explain any of this? No, he doesn't. He just like mentions the story, and then he just moves on. He just casually mentions it. And so yeah, I don't know. I think that's a fun one. This is another really fun one. I really love this one. So why didn't Paul know that Ananias was the high priest? So if you go to the next chapter in Acts 23, Paul is then brought before the Jewish council, and he's struck on the mouth at Ananias's command, right? And so Paul gets sassy, they get mad, and they order him to be slapped. Now, Paul gets like heated, right? He starts crashing out, And he says, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall, right? And so the people who are with the high priest, they rebuke Paul and they're like, hey, what are you doing? You can't talk to the high priest that way. Would you revile God's high priest? And then Paul says, well, I didn't know he was the high priest. And it's just kind of like, well, wait a second. This is Paul, who was the Pharisee of the Pharisees, trained under Gamaliel, lived in Jerusalem for at least a long period of time, right? And so why doesn't he recognize who the high priest is, right? And so Josephus actually gives us some really cool background information. We find out that Ananias, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was appointed the high priest, but he was sent to Rome by the governor Quadratus to answer charges. Apparently, he was going around trying to like collect tithes like a mafia enforcer, and there was all these like criticisms and about how he was heavy-handed and just a terrible guy in general. So he had to go to Rome and answer for all of his shenanigans. Well, he ended up being acquitted over the whole thing, but in a way to kind of censure him, he wasn't restored to office. Like he lost his place, right? And so Jonathan replaced him as the high priest during Felix's term, but he ended up being murdered in the temple, and the office was actually left vacant. And so during this time, there's no high priest in any official capacity. That doesn't happen until Ishmael, the son of Phabi, is appointed by Agrippa, which happens after this, right? So Acts 23 happens just during that vacancy, like I said. But Ananias, who was deposed, was still walking around and strutting his stuff like he was still the high priest. So Paul, very likely, according to many scholars and commentators, think that he was throwing shade here, that Ananias wasn't really the high priest. He was being cheeky. He was saying, hey, I didn't know he was the high priest, because he wasn't. He's not the high priest. He's being sarcastic, which fits with Paul's character that we see in his letters, where he just lays on sarcasm very thick many different times. I mean, the famous one, of course, is where he's talking about the Judaizers bothering the Galatians, and he's like, hey, if they're going to bother you about circumcision, I wish they would just go ahead and like go the whole way, that they would be cut off. And when he's saying cut off, he could say cut off from the covenant, cut off from God, but also like cutting off the member. So we'll see more of Paul's sarcasm and how that entails historical evidence in a little bit here, but I just think this is a fun one. I don't know. I just like seeing Paul getting sassy and not caring. Here again is where Paul gets a little sassy with some people who have a lot of authority. This is Felix and Drusilla. In Acts 24 through 25, Paul speaks with Felix, the Roman procurator of Judea, and his wife Drusilla. This is the lead up to him getting, extradited to Rome to talk to Caesar and all that other stuff, which we never find out what happens there. Luke correctly names his wife's name Drusilla and notes that she was Jewish. This is actually kind of a rare and specific detail. Now, what's interesting about this is that Josephus confirms again these facts. Drusilla was Jewish, daughter of Herod Agrippa I, and married Azizus, or was married to Azizus of Emesa, but left him to marry Felix. And what's weird about this is Felix used a Cypriot Jewish magician to persuade her to leave her husband. Now remember, Elymas, the sorcerer, he was Jewish in Acts chapter 13. Apparently these Jewish little wizard guys were a common thing. They must have, I don't know, been syncretic in some of their beliefs with paganism or what. But yeah, that's pretty dirty. The guy's doing some Harry Potter moves to score somebody else's wife. Anyways, their marriage was a scandal in amongst the Jews, obviously, and it was considered to be adulterous and against the law. And so Paul, if you go back and you read Acts chapter 24, he mentions talking about the kingdom of God, and he talks about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. And it's precisely at this moment that Felix was afraid and said, that's enough. All right, Paul, you can go now. And so he gets uncomfortable in the situation. And like, it makes total sense of Felix's discomfort. But like, again, notice the author of Acts isn't explaining any of this background. He's not going out of his way to explain this. He just mentions it and leaves it in passing. And so, like, it's very subtle, it's very casual, but it fits exactly the historical context of this. And so, again, I think this one is just really cool. How these just dovetail very well together. All right. And so there's a couple more examples. This is probably my favorite, though. The whole Acts 27 is just chock full of historical goodies from start to finish. And I'll refer to you some resources that you can read more in detail about them. But we'll mention probably one of the biggest ones, Cauda, right? It's this tiny little island. I said biggest one, but it's a tiny island off of Crete. In Acts 27, 14 through 16, it describes Paul's journey to Rome when he's become a prisoner. And it describes how they didn't take Paul's advice about which city in Crete to spend the winter at. And he tried to go to a different city on Crete. So they don't listen to him. And they get into this pickle, right? They get caught by a northeaster, which is a great windstorm out of the northeast. And they find brief refuge next to a tiny little island called Cauda. Now, the other ancient authors, such as Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, and there's Ptolemy as well, who was like a famed kind of geographer of that time, they place Cauda in the wrong location, and also in a location that wouldn't even fit what Acts is describing. And again, this is Colin Hemmer. He says, in the places where we can compare, Luke fares much better than the Encyclopedia's Pliny, who might be regarded as the foremost first-century example of such a source. Pliny places Cauda opposite Herapitna, some 90 miles too far, and even Ptolemy, who offers a reckoning of latitude and longitude, makes a serious dislocation to the northwest, putting Cauda too near the western end of Crete in a position where it would not suit the unsteady narrative of our text. But Luke comes in and he just casually gets it right. The description in Acts fits its real location. Its real location fits the voyage described 100% in Acts. And so, like, that's just pretty cool. You have these Roman authors who are known for, geography and different things like that. They can't place this tiny little island, but Luke just drops it in there describing a shipwreck that happened, and he gets it right, which is kind of funny because you have people like Dennis McDonald go on Myth Vision, and he's like, oh yeah, the shipwreck in Acts chapter 27, it's totally based on like Homer's Odyssey. And it's like, right, sure, dude, you got it. And so as you can see from the illustration here, it's just this tiny little island off Crete. So yeah, that's not something you could just look up. All right, there's also the bit about his voyage that I think is super fascinating. Luke only gives a few scattered details about the ship's path from Cauda to Malta in Acts 27. It's also called Clauda. It's not a typo there. But they line up with real nautical expectations. A ship tacking 8 points north with the Euraculo wind would drift about 476 miles. So you remember there's this crazy windstorm, and they can't really do anything. They're just kind of like floating along. Would drift about 476 miles in just over 13 days at a speed of 1.5 miles per hour. Now, this actually comes from James Smith, who, writing in the early 20th century or late 19th century, I think, like late 1800s, early 1900s is what I'm trying to say. He wrote a book. I don't remember the title of it, but I have it on the end slide, so I'll make sure to get it to you. You can actually download it for free. He was somebody who traveled these areas. He was a ship captain, and he was reading the book of Acts, and he's like, is this just like made up, or like he wanted to like see if this was right or accurate or not. And he researched all this, and this is some of the stuff that he came up with. And so in Acts 27:27, it also says that they approached land on the 14th night. So going back to all what I was saying there, the drifting is exactly what we'd expect. We would think it would take about 13 days, and they approach land on the 14th night. So they're basically right on schedule. So in Acts 27:28, Luke also uses correct sailing terms like bolisantes for taking soundings. He gets the depth readings right, 20 fathoms, then 15. They match exactly what you would expect if they were nearing the reef near Malta. These are the details that you would expect to hear from somebody who actually knew what he was talking about. And then what's even more interesting is that Luke's account of the storm and shipwreck in Acts 27 reads like somebody who was there, but was clearly a landsman and not a sailor. He gets a lot of the actions right, like the things that the crew are on the ship doing right, but he doesn't explain why they matter. Like he doesn't even really know what they're doing. He just explains what they're doing, where he says what they're doing, but he doesn't explain it because like he doesn't know, right? And so in Acts 27:17, it says that they lowered the gear, chalasantes diskeos. This likely refers to removing extra rigging to stabilize the ship. A sailor would know why they're doing this, but Luke just offhandedly reports that it happened. In Acts 27:20, the crew, they get all discouraged. They say all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. They hit this low point, and Luke doesn't explain why, but they likely realized that they missed Sicily and were headed into deadly open waters. And so they were hoping to make it to Sicily and to be able to like be okay there and to stop there for a while, but instead no. And then Luke just records that all their hope was lost, but he doesn't explain why at all. And then Acts 27:29, the sailors throw out anchors from the stern, the back of the ship. That's not standard. You don't throw anchors out at the back of the ship, but in a desperate situation, it would keep the ship from facing the waves instead of getting wrecked broadside. Luke records the action, but he doesn't comment on how weird it was or why they would be taking such emergency measures. Luke 27:38, right before trying to beach the ship, they throw grain overboard. Well, why didn't they, why now? Why didn't they do that earlier? What's the deal? But we know that because lightening the load increases their chances of running the ship aground safely, that's why they did it. But Luke just notes the detail, but again, he doesn't explain why they did it. So all of this, according to Smith, who was a sailor, points to Luke being an eyewitness who wasn't trying to impress us with technical sailing knowledge. He was just telling the story as a landsman, as he knew it, right? And so a couple more here, and then we'll take a quick break. We're doing all the external confirmations here, and then we'll get into some more. And so Publius, the chief man of the island, Acts 28:7, it mentions that Paul is hosted by him, and he's called by this title, the first man of the island. Well, that's kind of an unusual title. Like, what's up with that? But this exact title is confirmed by multiple ancient inscriptions. Again, the New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce says that this is vouched for in both Greek and Latin inscriptions as the proper designation of the Roman governor of Malta. Archaeologist Titus Kennedy documents first century Greek inscriptions, honors Prudence, called the first of the Maltese and father, likely the same office. We have another inscription, the first man of Malta and Gozo during Tiberius's reign. We have a Latin inscription that says first over all in the municipality of Malta. So again, first man of the island, there's that whole kind of title there. And then Malta was under a Sicilian provincial rule, and Publius was likely the local Roman magistrate. Luke nails the official title and political structure just right. Again, this is a tiny, small, obscure detail that speaks towards historicity. Now, there is one objection that Acts 28 is wrong, because if you remember, Paul was trying to help the guys gather some firewood, and a viper bites him, and he just shakes it off into the fire, and the guys that saw it were like, oh my gosh, this guy must be a horrible person. He must be a criminal, and he's going to die. And the objection is that Acts is wrong because Malta today has no venomous snakes. But ancient Malta was probably a lot more wooded and less inhabited back then. And venomous snakes could have easily lived there, but have been wiped out by later farming, habitat loss, or other imported predators. Pliny the Elder and other writers note that venomous snakes throughout the Mediterranean, so there's no reason to think that Malta would be a necessary exception. But even if the skeptics are right, Luke calls it a viper, but that could describe any dangerous snake. He's an ancient writer. He's not necessarily doing modern taxonomy. And he's recording the islanders' reaction that this man must be a murderer, showing that they assume that the bite was lethal. So the narrative reflects their own theological kind of perspective. But Luke isn't, he's not trying to be Charles Darwin here and record all of this stuff scientifically. Like, he's just talking about what happened. And so this is one objection against the historical reliability of Acts that I would just say, like, I've heard here and there. It's a pretty bad one. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. Colin Hemmer, who I've mentioned and quoted a few times here, he talks about overland routes, coastal landmarks, provincial boundaries, shipping patterns, local cults, titles of local officials, legal procedures, languages, dialects, and even regional slang. Some of these we have mentioned here. He mentions 84 plus verifiable facts from chapters 13 through 28 alone. And so it's just kind of overwhelming evidence that he gets, like I said, from inscriptions and other ancient sources. So yeah, this is just a lot of stuff. So really good book. Check it out. It is a little more on the expensive side. I somehow lucked into getting a used copy in almost perfect condition for $6. Not to humble brag there, but yeah. So there you go. That's where I'm getting a lot of this information. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I could be here all day going through all of these. So right now we'll take a break and go back to some super chats before we get into another section here. Going to go over Josephine dependence. Well, in a way, Koopa, I've kind of gone over it if you think about it for just a second, right? So, and I'm trying to remember the name of the scholar. He's got a book on dating the New Testament, and I'm drawing a blank. It's on my shelf there. Maybe I'll just get up and grab it real quick. Hang on a second. Ugh. Okay. So yeah, Jonathan Bernier, rethinking the dates of the New Testament. He's got a good section where he kind of goes over Josephine dependence. It's pretty short, but I think it's I think Steve Mason, which I do have his book on the shelf there as well, is just kind of out to lunch for the reasons that I've already mentioned, is like strikes against the reliability of Acts mentioned by Bart, like the Theudas thing, right? Like if he's borrowing Josephus, then why does it look like he's making mistakes? Wouldn't he kind of try to paper over some of those things or clear it up or whatever, or not introduce things that look like mistakes, right? There's of course like the census, which is a famous objection, that like Luke gets the census wrong. Well, if he's borrowing Josephus, why is he botching key details of the census? As you can see, there's a lot of facts here that aren't reliant on Josephus whatsoever. Like these are like, I'm verifying these out of like Cassius Dio and other historians and archaeology and different things like that. There's also the fact that these are like really casual. So like going back to the example of the high priest, and does Paul know who the high priest was? Because it sounds like he doesn't. But when you understand that he's being sarcastic, well, like again, the author of Acts doesn't explain this vacuum, right? It's just kind of very casual. It's very subtle. It's kind of hard for me to imagine Luke going, you know what would be really cool? I'm reading Josephus here, and I'm writing this in like the 1st century, and I'm getting all of these details right from 1st century things and customs and different things like that, including like the one I mentioned about Sergius Paulus, which he could have easily got wrong if we're talking about late dating. And I'm just going to drop this little, weird thing about this conversation between Paul and the high priest, where Paul gets sassy with him. And I'm not going to explain the historical background whatsoever. It's just going to casually fit, so people realize in the future that I'm like this amazing genius or something. I don't know. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's the casualness of it that shows to me that there's independence. And so I think Mason is out to lunch. I think people who use his theory just need to stop because it's really bad. Inspiring Philosophy Again, I believe, has a video where he goes over this in more detail, so I would check that out as well. Let's see, another super chat here. VCOG, thanks Koopa for the super chat, by the way. Kind of off topic, but you mentioned it. I never got the pray it didn't happen in winter argument. Wouldn't it just prove that prayer works? I mean, yeah, I guess it could if you look at it that way. And so, yeah, I don't know. I guess you could argue that. But anyways, so I'll have to think about that one. You caught me. You got me on that one. So I will think about that, and maybe I'll post a comment on this a little bit later there. Acts, Luke and Acts, and this is just probably, I might have a little bit of brain fog at the moment. I had kind of like a weird night's sleep, and so I just not sharp on the answer there. I apologize about that. King Tesseract again, $5. Thank you again. Luke and Acts had to be written at a very specific time because many practices, traditions, and trade routes didn't exist after diaspora of the Second Revolt. And so, yes, that's what I was just kind of saying to Koopa there. There's just too many of them, right? And so there's too many of them. And a lot of these are time bound and location specific at that particular time. And so, second century, and just looking at Josephus, he's not going to be able to piece all this together. It just doesn't make sense to me at all. Let's see. So, thank you for that, King Tesseract. Good point. Thoughts on the adulterous woman is fake story? We talked about this in our last stream, Christian, that I had with Jonathan. If you want to go back to that, this is a little out of like the topic of the stream. I don't think that it's a fake story. I do think that it might be some sort of a scribal insertion. There are manuscripts that actually have it in Luke's gospel, like some of the early manuscripts have, or one of them has it in Luke's gospel, I know of. I don't think that it's necessarily a fake story. I just think the manuscript evidence is a little bit against it, in the sense of like it was later, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it was fake. This could be something that was passed on through oral tradition or something like that. And so to me, it's like not one of those. I know Muslims try to use stuff like that, like, oh, well, the long ending of Mark and the adulterous woman, and see, this is the proof of corruption. And it's like, okay, but like we can find all of these things through just looking at the manuscripts and comparing them. This is just how textual criticism works, but you're never going to find a Muslim Jesus in any of it. So to me, it's like, I don't get super excited about textual criticism just because it seems to be so settled, and it's just not an area that, I don't know, interests me a whole lot, to be honest. So, all right, we will move to the next section here. Jimmy Berman mentioned that it looks like this book is available for free on Archive, the one about James Smith. That is correct. That is correct. Just wanted to mention that there, because it's always good to get a freebie. All right, skeptical rejoinder, real quick, to all of the evidence that I'm providing so far with all of these external verifications that we have. The skeptics will often say, well, Testify, you're committing the Spider-Man fallacy. Don't you know that just because New York City is like a real place, that doesn't mean that spider sense is true, and all of those stories happen, right? And they try and act like just because you have these mundane elements in your story, it doesn't mean that all of the story, especially the supernatural parts, are true, right? They could just be making up stories. Well, the problem with this, besides the fact that it is massively anachronistic, is we're gonna go into those problems here. What's funny to me is that Bart Ehrman actually uses the Spider-Man fallacy objection. Like, I would expect a little bit better, because this is kind of like a low-tier Reddit atheist argument. But Bart picks it up. He doesn't say Spider-Man, but he basically says that the external confirmations found in Hemmer's book and elsewhere have zero relevance whatsoever. And then he tells this story about, like, I could make up a story about something bad happened at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I could give you a bunch of mundane elements about something that happened there. But if I introduced other things into it, it doesn't automatically make the story true. It just means that I was using those mundane elements to craft a story, right? They're not relevant at all. But Bart says that it matters when Luke makes mistakes. He says that it matters when he contradicts himself. He says that it matters when he contradicts Paul. He says that it matters when he contradicts things that we know in actual history. But suddenly it's not relevant when he gets details correct. But this doesn't make any sense, because if getting historical details wrong is evidence against historical trustworthiness, then getting them right is evidence for it. You can't just have it both ways, right? Evidence works in both directions. Now, what would it be like if Acts really was fiction? Like, let's take Bart's theory that Acts is mostly fiction and partial historical truth. What would it be like if that were true? The author somehow gathered all of these obscure details without the use of Google, Wikipedia, or ChatGPT. He made up travels for Paul and pretended to be his companion, scattering these obscure details casually everywhere and inventing a genre that didn't exist at the time. Remember, I said this is completely anachronistic. Modern historical fiction didn't come along until like hundreds and hundreds of years later. The author created a hoax by pretending that this was real history. Then the author sent this carefully prepared hoax to somebody who probably hadn't traveled to these places himself, probably didn't know the details himself, and therefore he couldn't even be impressed by their accuracy. Remember that Acts was written to a dedicatee, Theophilus, who was likely Luke's patron. Then Ehrman thinks that Acts was written in the mid 80s, well after Paul's epistles, because Paul died in the 60s, but that it also contradicts Paul's letters. Remember all the contradictions that he brought up earlier? Now, these alleged contradictions are pretty contrived and easily harmonized, but they do show that Luke was probably not using Paul's letters because, again, he would have smoothed some of these things over and not gave at least the appearance of contradiction. But what kind of super clever hoaxer does that? If he could research obscure details of geography and language, couldn't he even bother to avoid apparent contradictions with Paul's letters, which would have already been in circulation by the time Bart thinks Acts was written? This isn't even a remotely consistent picture of the author. Like, what kind of an author does this? It doesn't make any sense at all. It's like this guy is schizophrenic, right? And so, like, this whole Spider-Man fallacy, especially with the Book of Acts, is just, it doesn't work. It's basically, I know it's impolite to say this, but it's basically retarded. So there you go. Undesigned coincidences. So this is another category of evidence that we're now going to talk about between the Book of Acts and Paul's letters. Now, there's a book by William Paley, who was writing in the mid to late 1700s, called Horae Paulinae, which you can download for free. He has dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of undesigned coincidences. I'm just going to go through a few. And so what an undesigned coincidence is there are places where the text of Acts and some passage in one of the Pauline epistles interlock in a way that would be unlikely to arise in mere fiction, or be unlikely to arise, I should say, in mere fiction or from simple copying. The interlocking suggests that both texts are truthful accounts. And so what you're going to see as we go along, like how this all plays out, but basically one account brings up something in passing that another account goes in and explains, but it doesn't do it in a way that's deliberate or intentional. And it's a mark of historical testimony. Like if I was at a baseball game and I said, I caught a foul ball and my friend was there and they said that they went to a baseball game and they got beer spilled all over them. Well, if you think about it, like you could imagine a struggle over a foul ball and people trying to grab it and somebody spilling beer on somebody. One person is supplying one detail, another person is supplying another detail, but they fit together in this undesigned kind of casual way that interlock and is rooted more in like historical truth, eyewitness testimony, what really happened and all that other kind of stuff. And so for starters, we'll look at one in Acts 15:37 through 41. If you read it, it tells us about a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas about bringing Mark with them on their missionary journey. So why did Barnabas want to take Mark with him so badly? Like, why are they splitting over this? This is weird. We never get the explanation if we're just reading Acts alone. But if you flip over to Colossians, it says that my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. And so, these two things fit together, right? Barnabas is the cousin. Colossians makes no mention of the rift between Paul and Barnabas, and Acts makes no mention of Barnabas and Mark's family relationship. Now, you could get really cynical and just say, well, Colossians is forged, and he had a copy of Acts, and he just slipped that in there at the end of a greeting section. But that's just weird. Again, that seems to me to be really unlikely. And then he doesn't mention the fight. He doesn't mention the dispute. He doesn't show like there was this like resolution or anything, and that Paul, forgave him and all this other stuff. There's no theological overtones whatsoever. It's just this casual mention. It's way better explained if these are just based on historical accounts. 1 Thessalonians 2:2, Paul says, I was treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. What happened, Paul, in Philippi? If we're just reading 1 Thessalonians alone, he doesn't tell us what happened in Philippi other than he was treated outrageously. We don't know. I mean, did he get served the wrong plate at the restaurant and like somebody spilled some hot tea in his lap? Like what was it? We don't really know. Okay. I mean, obviously that's a silly example, but you guys get the idea. But if we flip over to Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas, we find out, are imprisoned in Philippi, but freed by an earthquake. The jailer, fearing escape, nearly kills himself, but Paul stops him. The jailer then believes and is baptized with his household. And then the magistrates come out and they order a quiet release. And Paul's like, he puts on his Karen wig and he's like, no, they've beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens. And so he forces them to come out and apologize to him directly, and they ask him to leave the city. And so where does Paul go next? I'll give you one guess. Book of Acts, chapter 17, verse 1. Paul goes to Thessalonica. And so you could imagine Paul, after just being beaten and thrown in prison, is ticked off, and he's in Thessalonica, the very next place, telling them what happened and telling them how badly he was treated. But it's only when we put the two together do we get the full picture. Now, this is further evidence that Acts is independent of Paul's letters, and they're not just, these can't be derived from copying, because Acts and 1 Thessalonians present independent accounts of Paul's ministry. Acts 17, 1-4 emphasizes Jews and God-fearing Gentiles converting in Thessalonica during Paul's 3-week stay, which is pretty brief. But if you read 1 Thessalonians 1:9, it says that they turned from pagan idols and became true worshipers of Yahweh. And so now Bart Ehrman tries to turn this into a contradiction and say, well, see, there's a contradiction. In Acts, he's talking to Jews, but in Paul's letters, this is a Gentile church. But that's not reading Thessalonians very carefully, because if we read 1 Thessalonians 4:14-17, it reflects themes of Jewish eschatology. And then in 4:4-5, he warns believers not to live like Gentiles, showing that they were likely a mixed audience in the church. So this is, why can't it be both? I don't know. But Ehrman just tries to turn this into a contradiction, even though it just could be that Luke emphasized like the original audience. And we know that Paul always went to the Jews first in any region. So this isn't a very good contradiction at all, but it does show, again, that these are independent from one another. Acts isn't being like looking at Paul's letters and carefully crafting all these historical details. Now, another contradiction that Ehrman tries to raise that actually turns into an undesigned coincidence is Acts chapter 17. It says that Paul and Silas were preaching in Thessalonica, but are forced out by a mob, and they flee to Berea. But the mob follows them. They go, these guys were dedicated, apparently. They go all the way from Thessalonica, all the way down to Berea and follow. And then Paul is then sent to Athens, while Silas and Timothy remain in Berea. Then Paul sends instructions for them to rejoin him quickly. But in the next mention is Acts 18:5. They arrive in Corinth, not Athens, and from Macedonia, not Berea. So there's this apparent gap in the Acts narrative. And Ehrman, again, using the word precisely, says Acts 17 is clear and unambiguous. When Paul traveled to bring the gospel to Athens, he came by himself without Timothy or any of the apostles. But Paul himself is clear and unambiguous. In 1 Thessalonians 3, we learned that he came to Athens precisely in the company of Timothy and not by himself. It couldn't be both. What? No, that's just flat out wrong. 1 Thessalonians 3, 1-5 explains what Acts leaves out. Paul is worried about Thessalonian believers, so he sends Timothy back from Athens. And then Paul's arrival in Corinth, 18:5, reflects his return from Thessalonica, not Berea. So the two accounts interlock naturally. Acts omits a detail that 1 Thessalonians quietly supplies, and Acts expressly reports that a message was sent back urging Timothy to join Paul as soon as possible. So according to 1 Thessalonians 3, Timothy was in Athens shortly thereafter. Bart, there is absolutely no contradiction. If anything, the way that these two accounts dovetail with one another speaks of historicity, not the opposite. So Bart is just like off his rocker here. Here's another one. This is a simple example that I really like. Acts 18:3-5. It talks about how Paul was working with Prisca and Aquila every Sabbath. They were reasoning in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But then it says that when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So is Paul slacking here? Like all of a sudden, Silas and Timothy show up from Macedonia, And then Paul isn't working making tents anymore. He starts preaching full time. He's not just doing it on the Sabbath. So what's the deal here? Well, if you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 18 and chapter 18, chapter 11, 8 through 9, he says, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. And so, again, where's Paul at in Acts chapter 18? He's in Corinth. And he's trying to reason with people just on the Sabbath only. He's preaching, but otherwise he's working full time. Then he stops working full time when Silas and Timothy come. And then he says, brothers from Macedonia supplied his need. And so who's he writing to? The Corinthians, right? And so look at how these accounts just like fit together in a way, but there's no way that the writer of Acts is looking at 2 Corinthians and going, it'd be cool. I'm just going to kind of like explain that casually, but I'm going to leave out Timothy. I'm not going to mention Silas at all. I'm just going to leave that out. It's weird. And so, and then also in Philippians 4:15 through 16, we get further confirmation. It says, you Philippians know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, where's Philippi, Macedonia? No church entered into partnership with me, but in giving and receiving, except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent to me help for my needs once and again. So he says that this happened while he was in Thessalonica, but apparently it also happened when he was in Corinth. And you already see that it was a recurring thing that they just kept doing. And so, again, all of these three Acts, Philippians, and 2 Corinthians converging together to all pointing to the same thing, right? Here's another one. This one's really cool. When Timothy comes, right? So at first, this looks really confusing. 1 Timothy 4:17, Paul talks about, I have sent to you Timothy, right? This is why I sent him. I'm sending him. So he's already been sent. But in 1 Corinthians 16, when he's wrapping up the letter, he says, when Timothy comes. So Paul expects this letter to arrive before Timothy does. So we then infer that Timothy must have taken some indirect route to Corinth. Well, why do we say that? Because Ephesus is where he's writing this letter. Corinth, you see, is just a quick trip over the sea, right? If you're walking, you have to take, I don't want to say like a ferry, but like a smaller boat across the Aegean and that short little thing that you would see there in the corner from Troas. And then they'd have to walk all the way around through Macedonia to Corinth, to Achaia, which is where Corinth is in the region of Achaia. And so that's kind of a long walk. And so what explain, that would explain it. Like that's possible, but if we're just reading 1 Corinthians, we don't really know that. We would just have to guess, maybe that's what happened, right? Like Paul sends this letter via boat, but then Timothy takes this long walk to serve some kind of purpose. Maybe he's checking in on churches, taking collections, different things like that. But when we read Acts 19:21 through 22, we see that is exactly what did happen, that Timothy did take such a route, going up and around through Macedonia with a guy by the name of Erastus. Then we have this passing reference in Acts 24 that Timothy did in fact make it to Corinth. And so that the roundabout walk that he takes is there. But again, this would be really weird if he's reading 1 Corinthians and being like, oh, this is kind of weird. You know what? I'm going to piece these weird things together. I picked this up. I'm really smart, Luke, this gospel writer, and I'm going to write this narrative, but not explain, why he's coming to Corinth or anything else like that. It's odd. It's weird, but it makes more sense on the hypothesis of historicity. So, and then Erastus, right? Remember, he was with Erastus according to Acts chapter 19. So who is Erastus? Well, Erastus is identified as a city treasurer in Corinth in Romans 16:23. Paul mentions him there as well. Now, there's an inscription discovered in ancient Corinth, interestingly enough, that says, Erastus, in return of his aedileship, laid the pavement at his own expense. This confirms that Erastus was a prominent public official in Corinth, and this perfectly, again, matches Luke's detail that Paul was traveling with a known Corinthian while en route to Corinth. And so this again is like now we got all kinds of things converging. We got Romans in here backing this up. We have uh again archaeology backing this up, and everything again is converging. All of these things point in the same direction. And I hope you guys see at this point, like this is a pretty powerful cumulative case. This just keeps piling up and piling up and piling up. All right. So there's more undesigned coincidences. Timothy's upbringing. Paul says that Timothy knew the Jewish scriptures from childhood. But then Acts tells us that he wasn't circumcised until later. Well, how exactly does that happen, right? Wouldn't he be circumcised? You would expect it. Well, Acts 16:1 says that Timothy had a Jewish mother, but he had a Greek father. And 2 Timothy 1:5 gives us the mother's name, Eunice, and also he gives the grandmother's name as well. His mother passed on this Jewish teaching, according to 2 Timothy. But apparently the dad was like, okay, yeah, circumcision, that's like a bridge too far for me. But again, this fits together. If these are historical accounts, and it makes sense. You could imagine a Roman father being like, yeah, no, we're not going that far, Jewish wife. But again, all of these details fit together, but none of them are trying to explain one another, right? Priscilla and Aquila, at the end of Romans, Paul is just giving like this long list of shout outs. And he says, greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Jesus Christ, who risked their necks for my life. All the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. And so just, what's up with this greeting? Why do they get this special shout out? We're told that they're basically located in Rome, just from reading this particular reference, because he's writing to the Romans, so he's telling them to greet them, right? So like they're there. They're called fellow workers in Christ Jesus, so that's kind of a nice pat on the back. He also says that they risked their their necks for his life. And so like, what's up with that? If we're just reading Romans, we don't know. And he says that all the Gentile churches give thanks for them. Like, what Gentile churches give thanks for them? Why? Why are they giving thanks? Well, Acts fills in the details. Acts 18:2. We read that under the Roman Emperor Claudius, all the Jews were expelled from Rome. This would have included Priscilla and Aquila, right? And so that explains why they weren't there for a while, but probably relocated. And this is a detail that's actually confirmed by the Roman historian Suetonius. Acts 18:3 and 18 says that Paul stayed with them and that they had traveled with him, and they were present with him during the mob violence in Corinth. Remember, they were making tents with Paul in Corinth and all that other stuff. And then Acts 18:12 through 17, things get ugly. There is a mob and they end up facing danger. And so that would be them risking their necks. And it's clear how they were fellow workers with him in Christ Jesus. And then in Acts 18:5 through 11, Paul turns to the Gentiles in Corinth with their help. So that would explain why all the Gentile churches give thanks for them. So again, these things seamlessly just kind of fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that make way more sense if this is history and not just made up. Again, it would be weird if somebody's reading Romans and they're like, what would be cool? Let's explain all of this stuff, but like in this really subtle kind of way. Again, that's goofy with all of these different things. But later he's going to contradict Paul totally. Like this isn't a clear picture of an author. All right, we'll go through a few more examples. Phoebe is mentioned. She's given a shout out in Romans 16. He says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchreae. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people and give her any help she may need from you, for she has been a benefactor of many people, including me. So Paul is writing from Corinth to the Romans. This implies that Cenchreae was close by. But Acts 18:18 independently notes that Paul visits Cenchreae. I might have said that 3 different ways. I apologize. When he's leaving Corinth. And so Paul stayed on in Corinth. This is Acts 18:18 for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae because of a vow he had taken. All right. Well, if you look at a map, there's Corinth, and boom, there's Cenchreae. You see the 2 red dots there. in the left-hand corner. They are right next to each other. It makes total sense. And so, yeah, just another example. There's a mention of Apollos in 1 Corinthians. It says, 1 Corinthians 1:12, I follow Apollos, I follow Paul. If you remember, the Corinthians are very sectarian. They have their favorite preacher, and Paul is rebuking him for that. And then he's correcting them, and he's saying, look, I planted, but Apollos watered, right? And so think about that. If I planted and Apollos watered, that implies that Paul ministered in Corinth first, and Apollos came after him. Well, if we flip over to Acts, again, we have confirmation of this. Acts 18:19 through 19 and 23. Paul leaves Corinth. He travels through Ephesus and returns via Asia Minor. Then in Acts 26 through 27, Apollos comes along. He's taught by Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus. Then he travels to Achaia. Well, the capital is Corinth. And then in Acts 19:1, Paul returns to Ephesus while Apollos is still in Corinth. This is what we read in those verses. But Acts never says Apollos went to Corinth, but Paul's letter assumes it. And so, again, this is an unforced, detailed match that fits both chronologies perfectly, but it's just written in this really subtle, kind of casual way. More on Apollos, 2 Corinthians 3:1. Paul makes this weird reference, kind of sarcastically, saying, are we to begin to commend ourselves again? Or do we, as some of you do, need letters of recommendation to you or from you? So Paul's getting kind of bent out of shape here. And he's talking about letters of recommendation. And he's saying, I don't need a letter of recommendation. You guys are my letter. So what's this odd offhand kind of angry reference about letters of recommendation about? Well, Acts 18:27, it says that when he, Apollos, wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote the disciples to welcome him. So Apollos had a letter of recommendation. Now, again, the Emperor Augustus had made Corinth the capital of Achaia. This fits perfectly with the timeline in Acts 18 and the beginning of chapter 19. And so these fit together in this unforced, casual kind of way. A couple more here. Then we'll get back to some super chats. Paul of the tribe of Benjamin. Paul alone tells us Paul's Hebrew name was Saul. Paul's letters reveal that he was of the tribe of Benjamin. This makes perfect sense. Saul, the first king of Israel, was a famous Benjamite. Naming children after notable tribal ancestors was pretty common in Jewish culture, as we know. Think about all the Judases that were around in first century Judea because of Judas the Hammer, right? And Maccabees and different things like that. Acts and Paul's letters supply independent details that fit together naturally. And so Acts gives us the name Saul. Then Paul, he mentions tribe of Benjamin, but he never mentions he was Saul. But they fit together really, really well. And so another little indicator of historicity there. And then this is another one that's kind of more of an external confirmation, but we'll throw this one in here as an undesigned coincidence as well. Again, answering Koopa's question, is there dependence on Josephus? I don't think so. We get some details from Josephus that dovetail together, but they do so in this really subtle, undesigned way. Acts 9:31, just out of nowhere, it talks about Paul escaping, and that's basically it. And then we just get this kind of throwaway line at the end of the chapter. Then had the churches rest throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria. Well, in Josephus, both in Antiquities and Jewish War, he records Caligula, who was the Roman emperor at the time, ordered to place his statue in the temple, right? Well, this provoked mass outrage, as you could imagine, and panic, and this would have diverted attention from everything else, including persecution of Christians. And so chapter 8, persecution, chapter 9, persecution, and then all of a sudden, nothing. But Luke gives absolutely no explanation of the rest. But Josephus independently provides the historical reason, and the two accounts fit together perfectly. So there you go. There are a bunch of these. And again, I'm just giving you the tip of the iceberg. Jorge Paul and I, free to download, William Paley. He gives example after example after example after example. Again, he's writing in the 1700s, and he uses some archaic language at times, and his sentences are a little run on at times. So if you have a real problem with that, Lydia McGrew has a book, Hidden in Plain View, where she goes through undesigned coincidences in both the Gospels and in Acts. And if you want like an updated, best of the best version, where she just gets the best examples out of Paley, I think she has a few original examples of her own, then be sure to check out that book. You could probably get it downloaded on Kindle for like $10. Or if you have a, I think the Kindle Plus or whatever the membership thing, it's one of those books you can just download for free for like a month or whatever. So avail yourself to that resource. So we'll get to some super chats real quick. How was Paul a Pharisee? If he was the tribe of Benjamin, not Levi, you don't have to be from the tribe of Levi to be a Pharisee. So I mean, it's that simple. Acts 24:5-14. Paul identifies as a ringleader of Nazarenes, aka the Way. This sect believed on Christ for salvation and kept the law of Moses for discipleship. What shall we say, brother? Interested in your thoughts. Paul believed that Jews were to keep the law and still did. That's why in Acts we just saw he took a vow and shaved his head, probably a Nazirite vow. He takes another Nazirite vow at the behest of James when he is accused of bringing Jews into the temple. He flat out says in his defense, like, I keep the law just like you guys, repeatedly throughout the book of Acts. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he talks about Jews, and he's saying, have you been circumcised? Well, don't remove the marks of it. You know, if you're Jewish, stay Jewish. And he's referring to a practice that happened during the Maccabean period because of the harsh persecution of the Jews during that time, leading up to that whole revolt, that there were some people who were actually removing their marks of circumcision. And Paul saying, don't do that. Like, if you're Jewish, stay Jewish. And so, you know, if you look at the council at Jerusalem, the whole idea is like Gentiles do not have to keep the law in order to be saved. And so that's how I would reconcile that. He's not saying, he's saying like, I don't think he believes that he has to keep all the Jewish everything in order to be justified with God. He's justified by faith through Jesus Christ. But as a Jew, he still keeps the law. He's just saying that other Jews, they're not obligated to keep the law at all. And so yeah, I don't think that there's a contradiction there at all. I've done a few videos on this in the past, so I don't remember the title of them, but just look at my library. It should give itself away by the title. So, all right, we are headed to the last section. Like I said, this is a bit of a long one. Artless similarities. There's only one Paul. So this is similar to undesigned coincidences, but this is about the personality of Paul. Now, I did a video on this not that long ago, but we'll kind of run through some of the ones just as a quick recap if you haven't seen it. So basically, they refer to the casual consistency with which a character is portrayed across different episodes involving a different character. Now, this is Uta Renke Heinemann, a German critic of the New Testament. She says, Acts and the epistles, there are two different Pauls. There's the historical Paul of the authentic epistles, and then there's the legendary Paul of Acts. So she's saying they're not the same person. They're completely different. And yeah, we'll put that to the test real quick. Now, these characteristics are again, pretty subtle. Like, they don't seem to be, because Acts, the author of Acts, was like really looking at Paul's letters and trying to sneak in like these sneaky little ways of like, oh, you know, let me write this long list of like subtle characteristics of Paul, and I'll just kind of blend them into my narrative. Again, this is better explained, this data that I'm about to go through, is if the guy just knew Paul and was quoting his words, right? So we see Paul is touchy about money in Acts 20:33-34. He says, I haven't coveted anyone's silver or gold. These hands supply my needs. 1 Thessalonians 2 and 2 Thessalonians 3, Paul tells the church there that he worked night and day to avoid burdening others, right? Paul was working with his hands. It's a consistent theme. He's always talking about like, I supply my needs and the people who are helping me by work. And in 1 Corinthians 9, he defends the right to be paid, but he says he refuses to use it. He even gets pretty like dramatic. He's like, I'd rather die than take money from you guys, right? And this is Corinth, especially, had all these like public speakers who were just being propped up by patrons. And Paul's like, I'm not going to be like one of those guys. I don't want to give any offense, right? So Luke doesn't explain this. He doesn't harmonize. It just naturally matches up, this characteristic of Paul being touchy about money. Paul's really big into conscience, right? Romans 9, he talks about his conscience confirms it through the Spirit. 2 Corinthians 1:12, he says that the testimony of our conscience, we have conducted ourselves in the world, especially towards you, with God-given sincerity and purity. And 2 Timothy, I know people dispute that, but to me, this is evidence that these are written by the same guy. He talks about serving God with a pure conscience, as did my ancestors. And then Acts 23:1, he says, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience. He says a similar thing in 24:16. I always strive to have a clear conscience between God and man. And so the language, the tone, and the priority are the same across all the letters and the book of Acts. And so this is just one guy, one mind, right? Not two different people, like the critic says. Paul is a tough boss. Remember, he refuses to take John Mark. He splits with Barnabas over it because John Mark, in the middle of the journey, who was their helper, was like, I don't know, wanted to go home and enjoy mother's cooking again and didn't like some of the bumpiness. And he isn't willing to take him because he thinks that he's basically punked out on him. He throws Demas under the bus in 2 Timothy, saying that he loved this present world. He's not sugarcoating. Galatians tells us that he was quick to confront Peter when he felt like he was living inconsistent. And then he's constantly sending people. He's constantly, utilizing his coworkers, Timothy, Erastus, Tychicus. He sends Timothy to reinforce his teaching to the Corinthians. He's super unsettled when Titus hasn't returned. He's like worried about him. When he could bear it no longer, he sends Timothy to check on the Thessalonians. And so he's constantly sending people out, moving people, and kind of pushing people around. So not pushing them around, but bossing them around, expecting a lot out of them, expecting them to really work. Now, we already touched on this one when we talked about the high priest. Paul is very sarcastic, right? Even Bart Ehrman has a whole blog post on this where he at least admits to this, right? He says, already you have what you want. Already you have become rich. He's writing to the Corinthians. Without us, you've become kings. And what that you did reign so that we might share rule with you. We are fools for Christ's sakes, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we are in disrepute. Bart Ehrman says that Paul is just ruthlessly mocking them here. And then later in 1 Corinthians 14:36, he says, or was it from you that the word of God came? Are you the only ones that it has reached? And so again, just stinging, biting sarcasm. Or writing to the Corinthians again in 2 Corinthians 9:11 through 19 through 21, he says, you gladly bear with fools, talking about the so-called super apostles, false teachers that were trying to unsettle the church, being wise yourselves, for you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. So again, Paul is just laying it on really thick here, and so he's like, you guys seem to prefer a bunch of phonies and a bunch of clowns. I feel like the super apostles and the Dawa bros have some real similarities there. 2 Corinthians 12:13, for in what were we less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself didn't burden you? So Paul admits that, yeah, I took offerings from other churches, but I didn't accept it from you because I didn't want to offend you because of the culture in your town. Right. And he's like, forgive me of this wrong, and so he's like, God forbid, I'm so sorry I didn't take your money. I didn't become a burden to you. And so again, he's laying it on thick. Then of course, the famous one that I already mentioned in Galatians, dealing with the Judaizers, and they're saying you got to become circumcised in order to be saved. And Paul's like, no, you don't. And he's saying, I wish these people would unsettle you, would just go ahead and emasculate themselves. I mean, that's as heavy sarcasm as you can get. Well, we see this sarcasm also in Acts, like I said, with chapter 23. And then in Acts 13:46, he says he gets pretty sassy with the Jews there in that area. And he says, "You judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life. We'll go to the Gentiles." And so he just takes the gloves off and he's like, "Oh, okay. You think you're too good for eternal life? All right, well, see you later," Or again, the example that we mentioned in Philippi, they've beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and now they try to throw us out in secret. No, let them themselves come and take us out. Or then Paul, when he's before Agrippa, he's like, he says, "I wish everyone was like me, except of course these chains," right? So Paul is just constantly using this sarcasm. It's just a personality trait. And like, just see how the same Paul, the same sarcastic Paul that we see in his letters, just shines completely through in the book of Acts. But again, it's in these little subtle, undesigned ways that don't look like fiction. It just looks like somebody who actually knew Paul. And so here's another one, and you'll see how this fits in a moment. There's 3 accounts of Paul's conversion that we talked about earlier. Bart says there's contradictions. I'm going to talk about a different way that actually shows like these aren't different accounts, and actually these are rooted in historical testimony right now. Acts 9, Luke narrates Paul's conversion. Acts 22, he makes a defense to an unfriendly mob, Jewish mob at the temple in Jerusalem. Acts 26, he makes his defense before Festus and Agrippa. Now, look at how these accounts fit these very different conditions, right? So, first of all, in Acts chapter 9, we'll just mention that Luke, who was, according to church tradition, a medical doctor, and according to even, I believe it's in Colossians, or is it 2 Timothy, where it's mentioned that Luke is a doctor. And so it's interesting that he gives the medical details of the scales and everything else in the restoration of Paul's sight. And then in the speech at the temple, it's interesting to note that Paul is very careful to appeal to Jews. He speaks in Aramaic. He calls his listeners, if you read this really closely, and I encourage you to go back, read the 2 accounts, Acts 22, and Acts 26. In Acts 22, he speaks in Aramaic. He calls his listeners brothers and sisters. He explains that he's raised in Jerusalem, like he's trying to build all this common ground. He name drops Gamaliel. Like he says that I'm trained under Gamaliel, guys, like this big head honcho that's part of the Sanhedrin, this person that you know very, very well. And then he appeals to the Jews in Acts 22 by saying, talking about the law of our ancestors. He says that he was zealous for God, as any of you are today. He describes Ananias, a Christian, as a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living here. And then he holds out, as long as humanly possible, from using the word Gentiles, because that's what they're saying. He brought Gentiles into the temple. And as soon as he says that he's sent to the Gentiles, they freak out and a riot breaks out, right? And so notice, like when he speaks to Jews, he's really trying to build as much common ground as possible. Now, when he speaks to Gentiles, when he's before Agrippa, suddenly he has no fear of interruption or outbreak of violence. He has time to develop more doctrine. He has time to go into his testimony more. And his strategy is to draw a sharp contrast between himself and the Jews. Now he's pitting himself against the Jews. Suddenly, the Jews are his accusers and adversaries. And you could imagine a Roman guy who's constantly dealing, a Roman leader. I mean, I know there's some Jewish background or whatever, but he's dealing with their crap all the time, right? So he's pitting them as accusers and adversaries, and he would probably be like, yeah, these guys are a pain in the butt. Then he calls the Christians in Damascus saints. Then he says that he tries to force them to blaspheme. So he just flat out admits that he was a persecutor of these people. And then he doesn't mention Ananias at all, because why, again, would Agrippa even care about this guy? And then he references his own mission to the Gentiles. He doesn't disguise it. He doesn't delay it. He just lays it all out there. Yeah, I've been going to the Gentiles and preaching this message. And then he mentions that the voice on the road in Damascus spoke to him in Aramaic. So that indicates that Paul wasn't speaking to Agrippa in Aramaic. He's speaking him to in Greek, right? They're speaking the same language. Well, again, this ties into what Paul says about his very own personality. To the Jews, I became like a Jew. This is in 1 Corinthians 9, to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those who are under the law. To those not having the law, I become like one who is not having the law, though I am free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And so you see, this is exactly what Paul describes. And again, I don't think like somebody is reading First Corinthians 9, the author of Acts, and being like, yeah, let me really carefully craft all these speeches. These just make better sense if like he's getting this information, these summaries of these speeches, and like this is basically how these speeches were said and how they went down, right? And they fit together perfectly with what we know about what Paul himself says about his own personality. All right, we're almost done. So one final thing. I think it's pretty clear that Acts didn't copy Paul's letters because of the alleged discrepancies between Paul and Galatians, Paul and First Thessalonians that Bart Ehrman brings out. But there's also the fact that Acts never even mentions Titus, who in Second Corinthians and all throughout through several of Paul's letters, Titus is just never mentioned in Acts. Like, so what's going on there? We would expect if the author of Acts was copying Paul's letters, like, where's Titus, right? Like, let's have at least a few Titus stories, right? There's Paul's suffering list where he lists out all the bad things that he went through: 5 floggings, 3 beatings, a stoning, 3 shipwrecks. Well, Acts only mentions 1 beating, 1 stoning, and no shipwrecks until we get to Acts chapter 27, which is too late. And so that'd be like after this. And so like he has all this opportunity to tell some really tough tales and the woes and hardship of the Apostle Paul. And like, we don't get any of that, right? Like we get stuff that we wish we knew more about, right? There's also Paul's escape from Damascus. 2 Corinthians 11:33 says that the governor under Aretas is the one who he was escaping from. Well, Acts 9 says that it was the Jews. Well, it's not hard to harmonize these. Maybe the Jews requested Aretas to do something about it, and like what's done through somebody else is done through another, as one might say. But like, it's not hard to harmonize, but you would think like the author of Acts would try to smooth this out, right? And say, no, it was, Aretas that drove him out or whatever. But he doesn't, right? And then First Corinthians addresses major issues in Corinth: marriage, singleness, food offered to idols, all kinds of stuff. Yet Acts never mentions these, and even presents a stricter stance on food. The Jerusalem Council seems a little more strict than what Paul was actually like pushing on the Gentiles, right? And so again, this is not what you would expect if they are dependent. And so you can't just say, well, I can explain away all these undesigned coincidences and the unity of Paul's personality by copying, okay? Like, that's not going to work. It's not going to fly. So to conclude, this is the argument. If Acts is historical, if Acts is historical, now you guys can see why I narrate a lot of my videos. Paul wasn't a rogue. He was tight with the apostles, right? Barnabas vouched for Paul in Acts chapter 9 to the apostles, saying he preached Jesus without fear. In Acts 15, the apostles themselves send Paul on missions as a representative, risking his life for Jesus. And then Acts 21:8, Luke was with Paul when he met with James and all the elders in Jerusalem, giving him a chance to interview tons of witnesses. Anti-Paul goofballs are wrong. Acts isn't some propaganda created to smooth out disagreements. Also, if what I'm saying is correct, and I definitely think by now y'all should agree, if this is correct, Islam is false because the apostles and Paul preached Jesus's death and resurrection, which is the opposite of what Islam claims. Acts 3:15, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses to this fact. 1 Corinthians 15:3-5, for I received what I passed on to you, which most people think that's through the apostles, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Now, remember, the Quran says that the disciples are to believe in him and his messenger Jesus, and they said, we believe and bear witness, and we are Muslims. And Surah 3:55 and 61:14 says that Jesus' followers became dominant. But there is no dominant Islamic Jesus-following sect that agrees with the Quran. Instead, precisely what Paul, and by extension also the apostles who backed his missions, taught, won out. So the Quran is 100% lying. And so there you have it. that is it. That was the Big Axe stream. And yeah, let me give you some resources real quick, and then we will be done. So resources for further study. I already mentioned Colin Hemmer, the Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. A little more on the advanced side, and a little on the more expensive side, but definitely worth it. Jefferson White, if you want a popular level treatment of all of this, Evidence in Paul's Journeys, you could probably get it off of Amazon for under $20. He takes a lot of the same information that I'm giving you here, gives you a pretty short, popular level book, probably under 120 pages or so. Definitely check that one out if you're looking for just an easy like entryway into this. Craig Keener, his commentary on Acts, thick and expensive, but definitely worth it. And so, and then Lydia McGrew, Hidden in Plain View, I already mentioned. It's more beginner to intermediate. I would say probably more on the beginner side of things. She gives you the undesigned coincidence argument for Acts as well as the Gospels. And then William Paley, Hora Paulinae, is free. You can download. And then James Smith, The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. There's also some good books that you can get free from Sir William Ramsay as well on this. And so, all right, I believe that's it. Let me see if there's any other super chats. I don't think that there are. So I hope you found this stream to be helpful. Go through it. If you want a copy of the slides, email me testifyapologetics@gmail.com, and I would be happy to share it with you. Be sure to check out the resources. And then I'm working on a video right now, just responding to some of the stuff that Alex O'Connor said on the Flagrant podcast. Might do possibly a series of videos there. I would like to be able to do more lives like this. And so if you guys like these, please let me know in the comments, these deeper dives. There's only so much I can kind of go through in a 5-minute video and just kind of give you an introduction. And you guys do know that I like series and I like stringing these things together. But let me know in the comments if some of you like these deeper dives. I know they're not necessarily for everybody, but, you know, yeah, some of you might like, you know, a lot more than just kind of the basic introduction to something or the short series. So let me know, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you guys so much for watching.